The sunshine much hazier as we head towards lunchtime, but elsewhere across the UK it's going to be actually a dry and fine day, a much more settled day to come tomorrow compared to today. Less of a risk of any of those showers rattling through. It won't feel too bad in the sunshine. Temperatures are still below average, but it's definitely warmer than it has been lately, and it will become even warmer as we head into Saturday as well, as we pick up that westerly wind more widely. Still potentially a fairly chilly start though across parts of England and Wales, but it's quite windy and wet weather will push into parts of Western Scotland, Northern Ireland through Saturday, and we'll see the rain persist here all the way through until Saturday evening, and then when it will sink further south into more central areas, with further wet weather to come early next week across the north. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You could beat good luck.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion. Mark meets at My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Let's go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan.
GB News royalty with
Your perfect start to the weekend.
lucky us.
Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions.
That raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return.
And a few surprises along the way.
Might be cold in this studio.
That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 to 9, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either. This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on Save the Nation tonight. The government spending watchdog has confirmed what we all expected. Owing to low birth rates and net zero policies, the Western world is facing bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the government NHS review has revealed that in spite of record funding, the system has failed. I'll be speaking to a frontline paramedic in a moment. A new committee has been set up to assess whether MPs having second jobs is in the public interest. As Nigel did earlier, tonight I will be speaking out. Plus, State of the Nation Book Club returns with conservative philosopher Madsen Peary as he publishes his latest book, The Philosophy of Conservatism. And most excitingly of all, Somerset beats Surrey by 111 runs at Taunton. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my most intellectual panel, GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the journalist and Conservative peer, Paul Goodman. As ever, you know it's a crucial part of the programme. Let me know your views. mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, it's your favourite part of the day, the News Bulletin with Lewis Mackenzie.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob. It's 8 o'clock. I'm Lewis Mackenzie in the GB Newsroom. Sir Keir Starmer says the NHS is broken but not beaten, delivering a stark message after a damning report into the health service. The review highlights ballooning waiting times, A&E delays and poor cancer care. Speaking earlier, the Prime Minister warned there will be no more money without reform and said big shifts are needed to secure the future of the NHS.
Only fundamental reform and a plan for the long term can turn around the NHS and build a healthy society. Now, it won't be easy. It won't be quick. It will take a 10-year plan, not just the work of one parliament, but I know we can do it.
Ukraine has called on the UK and the US to lift restrictions on using Western weapons against Russian targets during a visit by the Foreign Secretary and the US Secretary of State. At a press conference in Kyiv, David Lammy and Antony Blinken praised Ukraine's bravery, but avoided committing to President Zelensky's request to use long-range missiles for strikes inside of Russia. Discussions will continue in Washington on Friday. Harvey Weinstein has been hit with new criminal charges as the disgraced movie producer gears up for a possible retrial. His 2020 rape conviction was overturned in April after a judge allowed testimony from accusers not formally involved in the case. Prosecutors in Manhattan are now investigating new sexual assault claims as more women come forward. He continues to deny all allegations. A 17-year-old boy has been arrested as a part of an investigation into a cyber attack on Transport for London. The National Crime Agency says the teenager was detained on suspicion of offences under the Computer Misuse Act. It comes as TfL says some customer names and contact details have been compromised in the security breach. And in a sign that major changes could be ahead for the UK's workforce, health and care worker visas applications have plunged by 83% from April to August of this year. New figures from the Home Office revealed dependent visa applications also dropped by 73%. Meanwhile, student visas saw a 17% drop, but dependents of students took a sharper hit with an 83% decline. In contrast, applications for skilled worker visas rose by 18 over the same period. A Royal Navy warship has seized £160 million worth of cocaine in the Caribbean, intercepting a so-called narco sub in a joint operation with the United States. HMS Trent sailed around 200 miles south of the Dominican Republic, seized 2,000 kilos of cocaine, marking the ship's 8th drug bust in under 7 months. And taking space exploration to new heights, 2 civilians just completed the first ever commercial spacewalk. Billionaire Jared Isaacman and crewmate Sarah Gillis floated over the SpaceX Dragon capsule 400 miles above Earth using experimental spacesuits. Without the usual safety of an airlock, the daring duo tested life support systems in the vacuum of space. Well, those are your latest GB News headlines. More from me at 9 o'clock. Now, it's back to Jacob.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. The Western world is facing a financial crisis which could see society collapse in slow motion. The spending watchdog, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, is wrong about almost everything. But today it has issued its long-term financial risk projections, and the gloomy conclusion is at least worth examining. Essentially, we are living beyond our means. Public spending is already 45% of GDP, but the new projection suggests over 50 years this will increase to 60%, with revenues remaining the same as they are now. If we continue on this track, we could expect the debt-to-GDP ratio to go from 100% to 300%. We're on this financially unsustainable path for 3 main reasons. The first is that since COVID, a shift in public mentality has occurred, illustrated by vast increases in the numbers on welfare, who have a sense of entitlement, expecting the state to solve all their problems. The state's presence has become ubiquitous. It means the economy is overregulated, that people are not incentivised to work, and that productivity is stagnating. Our annual welfare bill alone is nearly £300 billion of your money. The second is our obsession with net zero. The elite believes it can control global temperatures by modifying our carbon emissions, despite the fact that we are responsible for a mere 1% of the global total. This is already costing us billions of pounds, but it will cost many billions more, making energy more expensive and putting thousands of jobs in industry in jeopardy. With this financial background, when we're competing with fast-growing emerging market economies with much lower welfare bills, or indeed expectations of welfare, means that we simply cannot afford to pursue the policy any longer. And the third, and arguably the most important, is our demographic crisis. The first Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, once said, "Demography, not democracy, will be the most critical factor for security and growth in the 21st century." But the UK birth rate has been in decline since the 1960s. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Darren Jones, recently claimed that the only reason debt projections are soaring is because, oh, what a surprise, of the Tories' mismanagement of the economy. But the chairman of the ABR, Richard Hughes, formerly of the left-wing cradle of Labour MPs, the Resolution Foundation, has rejected this claim and pointed to the fact that our debt reflects our demographic problems. Fewer children means an older population on average. An older population means fewer people in work, supporting more people receiving pensions. All of these trends are being replicated across the democratic Western world, whether in Europe or the US or even Japan and Korea, where it's more firmly entrenched. The only way to tackle this looming crisis is to take an axe to the state, slashing costs in every nook and cranny that it has crept into. We must roll back our welfare system, getting the 5.5 million people of working age back into work. We must roll back the net zero agenda that is incurring costs of tens of billions of pounds to the economy every year. And most importantly, we must increase our birth rate. And I have done my bit. As the inamorato of the left, the Holy Father Pope Francis says, people ought to have more babies and fewer pets. Failing on any of these points, we'll see Western society sink like a ship taking on water, inch by inch, the Titanic, no less. As ever, let me know your views. Email mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm now joined by the former Conservative MP, Miriam Cates. Miriam, first of all, thank you for standing in for me last week, which was much appreciated. But what can we do to encourage people to have more children? Because demographics are the real heart of this problem.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And as you said in the monologue, across the Western world, this is the case. I think the only Western country that has a healthy birth rate that's above the replacement rate, is Israel. That's the only Western country that isn't in decline. But what's really interesting is that even some less developed countries, poorer countries like India, for example, are also struggling with their birth rates. In fact, India now has a well below replacement birth rate. So it's not even just a Western problem anymore. I think the problem is in the 60s, various scientists predicted that we wouldn't be able to feed the world, that the world was going to be overpopulated, that the population was going to explode. And of course, that didn't happen. We produce far more food than we ever did. We support far more people. We're far wealthier than we ever were. Far fewer people are in poverty. What they predicted hasn't happened. But we still have this mindset that the world is overpopulated and we've got to have fewer children. And that just isn't the case at all. And now what we're seeing in the West and what's reflected in the OBR's prediction today is that when there aren't enough babies born to replace people who leave the workforce, you have this total funding deficit. There are not enough taxes to pay pensions, essentially, and not enough taxes to pay healthcare. Now, we've kind of covered that up with immigration, which isn't a real solution to this problem, but it's kind of fudged the figures. That hasn't happened in Japan. That's why it's so much more stark. But very soon, it's all going to go bust, as the OBR have actually been saying for some time, but people haven't paid attention.
And what do we do to encourage people to have more children? Because the state makes every effort to make it expensive to have children. There's very little support and an awful lot of extra cost if you have children.
Yes, absolutely. And Britain has one of the least generous systems towards families in any of our competitor countries. So the tax system is an obvious target for reform. It shouldn't be the case that a household that has one parent that earns a lot and one parent that doesn't earn at all pays far more taxes than two parents that earn median wage, let's say, or two childless people that earn median wage. That penalises family. Also, the government's approach to childcare does not attract parents at all. Parents want to look after their own children when they're very small, but instead the only support you get from the state is if you put your child in an institution. Now, most people just want to be flexible. They want to do a bit of work when their children are young, spend a bit of time with them, but again, the situation doesn't help at all. Our housing prices are obviously very high. That puts people off from having children. But even though our system is very ungenerous, This is the same in other countries where their systems are much more generous. So I don't think it is just about economics. I think it's about culture. And we've really undervalued parenting over the last few decades, particularly motherhood. And I think we've just got to raise the status of parents, celebrate children, and make it a high status thing again to be a parent. And as you said, you've done your bit, Jacob. But unfortunately, the younger generation now either can't afford to or aren't attracted by the idea of settling down. So I don't think there are any obvious answers. There are some countries that are trying a lot harder than we are, but nobody has really found a solution yet. But I do think raising awareness is the first step, and so few politicians in our country understand why this is a problem.
Or are willing to talk about this, or the fact that we have a welfare system that encourages people not to have children within wedlock, but have them out of wedlock. We have divorce laws that have encouraged people, have made it extraordinarily easy for them to separate. And we have the tragedy of 250,000 babies every year being destroyed through our abortion laws. So we have a state that really militates against any degree of population growth.
Right, and in the past, people had children partly for the joy of it, but also for their own financial security, because before the welfare state, the way that you ensured you were going to be looked after in your old age, that your family business or your family work would survive, was to have children. Whereas now we've completely socialised the cost of old age. We have pensions, regardless of whether you've had children or not. You have free healthcare, regardless of whether you've paid into it enough or not. We've socialised the cost of old age, but we've privatised the cost of having children. So there isn't a financial incentive to have children anymore. They are purely cost. Now, of course, people aren't having children for the money. They're doing it for the love and the joy. But there used to be a link between having children and your own care in old age. That link has been severed, and so it's not surprising that people now see children as a cost rather than security for the future.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I certainly tell my 6 children that their job is to look after me in my dotage, which gets nearer and nearer every day. With me now is my panel, most intellectual panel, GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the journalist and Conservative peer, Paul Goodman. It's really Roy Jenkins' permissive society that has ruined our efforts to have children, all this divorce and abortion.
Well, when it comes to abortion, I think that it's the woman's choice, so therefore we have abortion laws. I don't think there's a way of actually going back on that. You can't make people have children. Obviously,
I agree with that,
Miriam
yes.
made the point that if the welfare state put some more money out for children, you could actually do it. But it's not something you can make people have. And there is a problem. I mean, we've got, at the moment, it's 3.5 people who are working, supporting pensioners. By the end of the next decade, we're down to 2.5, and then just 2 people. So we actually do need the population to grow.
But the welfare system is perverse, isn't it? Because it will pay anybody to look after a child as long as it's not the mother. This is, or indeed the father. This is just very odd, isn't it?
No, I mean, you could do it through the tax system. We would help, obviously, if you didn't have the 2-child benefit cap. There are a whole host of things you could do, but of course they all cost money. And what we're told at the moment is you can't afford to scrap the benefit cap. And so I don't see there's a solution, or at least not a short-term one, while we've got a problem with the finances.
And Paul, that's a fair point, isn't it? That we don't have any money. But could we change the welfare system so that there is at least equality between people who decide to have children and those who don't?
I think you have to look at what's happening worldwide, and throughout the Western world, birth rates are falling. And it's a rather sobering fact. If you project long enough into the future, it's very hard to see what happens to birth rates at all. It's only really in Central Africa now they're going up. In some bits of Latin America, they're steady. But throughout the Western world, they're in decline. The reason for that is that traditionally, poorer people needed children to look after them in their old age, and we're not in that situation now. So what do? The options are, one, you just simply rely on migration, but as we all know, that doesn't raise standards per head, living standards per head. Or second, you raise the birth rate. Or third, we all work longer. We've been more successful at that here than in, say, France, but you can't do that indefinitely. Or else we grow the economy more, which we've not discussed so far this evening, which, you know, to be fair, Liz Truss tried to do, but not with particularly successful results.
But can you grow the economy sufficiently if the number of working people supporting the number of retired people is shrinking year in, year out? By small amounts.
I don't think you can. I don't think you can rely on migration to do it. So either we are sooner or later going to have the debate people are having in Eastern Europe that politicians don't want to have here, about raising the birth rate, in which we have to say you are doing your very best, probably better, I suppose, than Nigel, either maybe, Nigel, it's not too late for either of us. Either you're going to have to do that, or you will end up cutting your services, and that is the prospect we're looking at now if we can't raise our birth rate.
And in Hungary, Mr. Orban has taken mothers who have more than 4 children out of the tax system altogether.
It's a bit early to see whether or not that's actually having the proper results. Or if it doesn't, I don't know what we do, but it is a fact of our national life. We have spent 50 years putting more money into older people. This is a problem for the party of which you and I are members, and less into families who've had no one to lobby for them.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. If you really want to be encouraged to have more children, bear in mind that if people like me carry on having 6 children, there'll only be people like us left. So if you want a world of Rees-Moggs, don't have your own children. Thanks to my panel. In a moment, in spite of record funding for the NHS, a new review has revealed what we all knew to be true, is in serious trouble. But what does this mean for you?
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
I'm not saying I don't want to be a mum, and I'm not saying I don't want to work, but it's definitely not easy.
It's just really tough for us mums, you know. Our job's never done, our work is never finished, and I think it's this movement, the real out-of-office movement, is something that just really resonates with me, and I think we should all talk more about how much work we do. I think a woman's work is never done. But I just think we all feel guilty. We have that mum guilt, you know. If you're working and being successful, you wish you were at home with the kids. And if you're at home, you're thinking, am I doing enough work?
Yeah, and of course the cost of childcare in this country means that a lot of families just frankly make that decision to have one of the parents stay at home, usually the mum, and they're just being squeezed out of the economy, and that's not good either.
Once you've done your job as a working mum, you come home and you're doing another 8 hours on top of it.
Mothers have a tendency, definitely historically, just to crack on with it. It's just something that they are expected to do, that they do without moaning, and now it's like...
Are we getting to a stage where it go down that well? In my experience, I have had someone say to me, well, if you can't handle it, why do you have kids?
Oh.
You know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yet, exactly that. We just need to talk about it, and I think it's healthy, and I think that's the main thing now, that we should be brave enough to be able to say, do you know what, sometimes it's difficult, but I'm really proud to be a working mum, and I tell my daughters that. I work really, really hard, and it's a good work ethic for them, you know, and that's what, you know, this campaign's all about.
Is there some resistance still, do you think, from some parts of society?
I do think there's resistance, and that's what this is about, is to try and get people talking about the fact that it has been awkward in the past, and some people don't understand a working mum's life, and that's why we need to try and talk about it.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we were talking about the West going bankrupt, and your views have come steaming in on the mailmogs. Steve slightly upsets me because he says it's a case of the wrong people having more children. Simple. I'm sorry to be the wrong people. Pam, I totally agree, Jacob. Pam, this is a message I prefer. With all you said, especially that we are being forced by a tiny minority to race to net zero. Let's have a referendum on it. Well, somebody said that earlier this week. It's becoming quite a theme. And Simon says, we don't need more children, we need less immigration, and to make the 5 million shying away from work to do so by giving them higher wages, cheaper than funding illegal immigrants. Remember the Brexit bus. Although the claim courted controversy, funding of the NHS has soared exponentially since 2018 by over £1 billion per week. This increase in funding per week is well over the promised £350 million that was so famously emblazoned on the bus. Yet the Prime Minister has branded the NHS as broken following Lord Darcy's review of the system. The NHS is performing dismally in comparison to its European counterparts. Countries such as Switzerland, Denmark and Belgium have similar percentage funding of GDP for healthcare, yet the NHS's technology, number of doctors and nurses and staff satisfaction seem to pale in comparison. Well, my most intellectual panel is still with me, GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the journalist and Conservative peer Paul Goodman. Paul, is this, to use the awful cliché, Nixon in China, that only the left can reform the NHS because nobody trusted the Tories to do it? We poured more and more money into it and proved that that wasn't the answer.
It's probably the case that you can only do really radical reform to a system when it completely breaks down. And although the NHS is in lots of trouble, I don't think it's sort of quite there yet. I think it is remarkable, and your viewers must be asking it, so we've just been through a general election where all this is meant to have been debated back and forth between the parties, and yet it's only now that the government is telling us that there is this massive crisis. I mean, I welcome the fact they're having this big review, although they're doing it in a rush. There was something about it that struck me as very odd, which is they first of all said the Tories have been underfunding the NHS for years, it's a disgrace. And the second was money doesn't solve the problem. Those two things didn't really seem to add up. So the question about this review, I found myself asking when I sort of saw Keir Starmer's speech this morning, is what are they actually going to do? Or is his plan just to say, we need 8 years, so all I'm asking you to do is re-elect me? And that's the message I heard from him.
Nigel, there is a complication in this, isn't there? That the argument that Paul was just setting out, Tories haven't given enough money, but money isn't the answer. But more money, now going back over an extended period, has not led to increased productivity. And the wage settlements that the Labour Party's just done with the junior doctors doesn't improve productivity either.
Well, I mean, the first thing is that what Keir Starmer was talking about is reform is the important thing. There's no more money without reform, not that there's no more money. So reform is key, and they've identified the right bits. You've got to make it a digital service to bring it into the 21st century. You've got to take care out of hospitals and put it into the community. And most important, you've got to make it a prevention service rather than a sickness service. So you've identified those areas, but money will come into it.
But none of this is new. All three of those points, making it more digital, was Gordon Brown's policy, and he spent £15 billion on a digital system that didn't work.
It didn't work, that's right.
Making it a health service, not a sickness service, was Jeremy Hunt's policy.
And it started to happen.
To an extent. But it is still there more for people who are ill, partly because people don't like being nagged about their health by the nanny state.
Well, I mean, if you're going to make it a prevention service, they have been doing that. I mean, I keep getting letters through the door inviting me to different tests and things like that. So it is actually happening. There are other things you can do to save money. I mean, it's ridiculous. We've just been talking about the ageing population. It's ridiculous that people are getting free prescriptions at 60. Why shouldn't they be getting them at 66? It's ridiculous that people who can afford private health have to go to a GP to get the referral letter. That costs the NHS £30. It's also ridiculous it's still so centralised, despite the idea that we should put it out in the community because it's local areas that understand what's going on. Let's think about scrapping NHS England and doing just that.
Well, that's such an interesting point, because NHS England stops the Secretary of State being responsible, but the politicians are always held responsible when things go wrong. Should we go back to what Anura and Bevin thought, that when a bedpan falls, it should be the Secretary of State who is accountable?
If you're going to have a national service, you can't simply hive off, as I'm afraid the Conservatives tried to do under the Andrew Lansley reforms, management to someone else and expect you not to be blamed if there are problems. So if you're going to have a nationalised system, you clearly have to have the politicians in control. I think you were right to point out that a lot of what the government was saying today, previous health secretaries have tried. I remember Sajid Javid, when he was health secretary, doing a whole speech about prevention. The difficulty with this stuff, of course, is that doing any of the very sensible things Nigel was just saying, you meet electoral resistance. You know, you try moving free prescriptions back to 65 or 66, and you'll hit a wall of resistance. So whichever government eventually has to tackle this is going to find it hard going.
And Nigel, how much enthusiasm is there in the Labour Party for using the private sector to help with the problems? Because West Streeting's been quite open to this. Keir Starmer was very against it.
Well, I mean, certainly West Streeting has a plan to do just that. I mean, his argument is that if you could use the spare capacity in the private sector for NHS operations, same price as the NHS would actually be charged for it, that would actually help. I mean, I don't think the Labour Party are ideologically against that at the moment.
Well, Keir Starmer said he wouldn't send a sick member of his family to a private person. Anyway, we've got to move on. Thanks to my panel. With me now is NHS GP David Lloyd. Dr. Lloyd, thank you very much for joining me. How difficult is it on the front line?
Golly. It's very difficult indeed. There are GPs sitting at home out of work because the last government imposed changes on us as GPs that meant we couldn't employ them. There are too few GPs. There's not enough in the community, as Lord Darcy suggested, and too much is being spent in the hospital. There's not enough on prevention, and there's too little on fixing the problems. We have an ageing population with lots of things wrong with them. We can do something about them if we start earlier in their lives and stop them getting ill so quickly.
And is there a problem with so many GPs being part-time?
Well, it is. And it's a function of the stress that they're under, because of the old days, when I was a young GP, I was working, 5 days a week and on call 1 in 4. But the intensity of work that we have nowadays, the amount of stuff that we have to do that hospitals used to do, the amount of paperwork, everything it is just such a strain that our younger GPs really need to go part-time because they just can't cope with the amount of time they have to spend.
Isn't that very generous of you, and dare I say kindly, that you were doing 5 days a week and 1 weekend on duty a month? That sounds much more stressful than doing a 35-hour week.
Yeah, but in those days, a mother had a grandmother who could they could say, your baby's got a fever, give them some Calpol and cool them down and call your GP on Monday. The moment a child gets a fever now, there's no grandmother, there's no health visitors, there's no backup in the state to help them. And so the first thing they do is dial 111 and expect an instant response. There's been a shift in the way that people use the health service in my career.
And how do you deal with that? Because if people want to use the health service, free at the point of use, in that way, how do you deter them from using it without perhaps introducing some charge for going to a GP?
Well, I think that Lord Darcy makes the point that a free universal health service with universal coverage is the only option. All the other countries that we're compared with either have it or are striving towards it. So no, charges aren't going to make a difference. It's about it's about empowering patients, giving them more knowledge, helping them prevent their health.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lloyd. Very much appreciated. More to come in just a moment as a new committee contemplates banning members of Parliament from having second jobs. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. It's going to be a very cold night tonight with a chance of frost, particularly across northern areas, but also a chance of spotting the aurora or the northern lights across parts of Scotland and northern England. We've got cold Arctic air at the moment, but that will be replaced by Atlantic air as high pressure builds in for the last day of the week into Friday. So that will develop clear skies quite widely, so a good chance of spotting the aurora as far south as northern areas of England, parts of Northern Ireland too. A few showers still clipping the coast of East Anglia overnight tonight, but for many of us, it's going to be a clear, dry and cold night. Chance of frost rurally just about anywhere away from the very far southeast. Towns and cities should be above zero by tomorrow morning, though, and it will be a fairly bright start to the day on Friday. The sunshine's still got some warmth to it, and the winds will be much lighter tomorrow morning, so it should still feel fairly pleasant first thing. Across coastal areas, there is still a risk of the odd shower and more in the way of cloud, particularly as we look further north and west to parts of western Scotland, Northern Ireland, where there is a greater risk of a few showers first thing tomorrow, as those westerly winds are bringing in the next weather front through Friday afternoon. That will spread into parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, turning the sunshine much hazier as we head towards lunchtime. But elsewhere across the UK, it's going to be actually a dry and fine day, a much more settled day to come tomorrow compared to today. Less of a risk of any of those showers rattling through. It won't feel too bad in the sunshine. Temperatures are still below average, but it's definitely warmer than it has been lately, and it will become even warmer as we head into Saturday as well, as we pick up that westerly wind more widely. Still potentially a fairly chilly start, though, across parts of England and Wales, but it's quite windy and wet weather will push into parts of western Scotland, Northern Ireland through Saturday, and we'll see the rain persist here all the way through until Saturday evening, and then when it will sink further south into more central areas, with further wet weather to come early next week across the north. Bye-bye.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, though.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Neil Oliver, every Sunday night at 6 p.m. on GB News. And if an hour is not nearly enough for you, go to gbnews.com for special extended episodes online every Friday at 9 p.m, where we can truly get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Well, we've been talking about the NHS and the mailmogs have come in, and Pat, yours mailmog is brilliant. Of course, the NHS needs reform, in inverted commas. The whole country needs reform. Nigel Farage type of reform. Excellent. I think that's very clever. The NHS has been broken all my life, and I'm older than the NHS. Well, Pat, from your wit and wisdom, I think you are drunk from the fount of eternal youth. Richard says the NHS needs total reform from the top down. Abolish all diversity and inclusion departments and review all management positions. Well, I certainly agree with you on the diversity and inclusion. The Modernisation Committee, dangerous word, modernisation, is looking to tighten rules on MPs hosting TV shows. Too late to get me. The committee, supposedly part of Labour's bid to drive up standards in the House of Commons, will be investigating whether MPs making paid media appearances is for the common good or displays a conflict of interest. I don't see how banning MPs from utilising cutting-edge technology to their advantage is antithetical to modernisation, but at least I would still have a job if I were banned. Well, my most intellectual panel's still with me. GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the journalist and Conservative peer, Paul Goodman. Paul, let me come to you first, because you've written about this extensively and pointed out that we have a choice. Do we want entirely professional politicians, or do we want the citizen legislator? Which do you think the country wants?
Tremendously amused by this report, because presumably if you're a Labour MP who's writing articles, fine, you'll be able to go ahead. But if you're a Conservative MP who's presenting on GB News, you won't. Why on earth could that possibly be the case? Look, I think people have got to make up their minds here, because we're very contrary creatures. On the one hand, we say, oh, we can't have MPs doing second jobs. That's a terrible thing. And on the other, professional politicians, oh, we don't want those just paid by the taxpayer. We want people with real-world experience. You have to make up your mind. And at the moment, the actual fact of the matter is being an MP is not a job, even if were it to be a job. How on earth could you have been Secretary of State for Energy, which you were, had nothing to do with your constituents directly in Somerset and yet continue to represent your seat. People have to make up their minds about this. I mean, either we go down the route by MPs are just legislators, all they do is represent their seat full-time, or you go back to what I think is a more sensible system, whereby MPs are there as representatives, not fully paid-up professional politicians, and they're able to keep in touch with the world outside.
That seems to me extremely sensible. And the crucial thing is that it is not a job. When I was first elected, people used to say to me, David Cameron is your boss. And I would always say, no, he isn't. My boss, or my bosses, are the voters of North East Somerset. And the more you have these regulations, the more you make MPs the employees of the House of Commons, rather than independent legislators representing their constituents.
Yes, you're not Westminster. When you were an MP, you weren't Westminster's representative in Somerset. You were Somerset's representative in Westminster, and I think that's an important thing, and that the constituents are your bosses. Yes, I think it's right to look at second jobs, the whole area of second jobs, which ones are actually OK and which aren't. I mean, the figures show that since the last election, MPs made £17 million from outside work. 15 million of that came from Tory MPs. So it is certainly worth looking at, but it may well be you look at it in a different way, that the chairman of the Standards Committee last year suggested it might be putting a limit on the hours an MP works outside Parliament. So making sure that they actually take the MP job as the primary job.
And money isn't really the issue, because a number of MPs will have private incomes that they have from investments from previous jobs, or indeed have inherited. Those aren't even declarable, let alone something that it would be possible to stop. So saying that you should only have MPs with inherited or historically earned wealth.
We're back to Victorian times.
We're back to Victorian times,
yeah.
And we really divide up Parliament, don't we? Because you have poor MPs for whom £90,000 is the be-all and the end-all, and you have some very rich MPs who have private money.
But I'm sure you do accept there are certain jobs that MPs have been doing that probably is not acceptable and is a conflict of interest in their parliamentary work.
That I completely agree with. I always thought lobbying as an MP was deeply, deeply grubby, and that MPs should always have known on their own honour, without a standards committee, that they should not be doing that. And if they were caught doing it, I would have thought their constituents would have thought it was pretty grubby too.
And that's probably the best way of dealing with it. It certainly did happen. It probably would happen if there wasn't sort of some form of policing. But essentially, it's just a really bad thing to have a sort of cadre of professional politicians. I love the way the rules catch you either way. Nigel was talking about putting an hours limit. So let's suppose you earn £500. You've earned £500 an hour if you only do 1 hour. But if you, of course, spread it out over the week, then you're not working on behalf of your constituents. You're caught either way.
Absolutely. And what do you do about the people who carry on with local government jobs, whose local government jobs require them to do significant hours for what they're paid to do, and yet that's by law allowed? And indeed, Paul's point, ministers.
Well, that's the sort of thing the Modernisation Committee needs to look into. I mean, it's whether or not that if you have an MP who is a doctor, that MP is in the public interest for that MP to carry on practising as a doctor or as a nurse. It's slightly different for a lawyer, but again, that they have to keep up their professional qualifications. So
much though we like to be rude about lawyers, they are actually in the public interest. We need justice to be done.
Yes, I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing about how it goes along with your work as an MP. So if you're a doctor, I can see that is complementary to your job as a Member of Parliament.
Isn't that entirely, or shouldn't it be entirely up to voters? That if they don't like their MP being a lawyer, and they never seem to object to Geoffrey Cox, they're entitled to vote against him. But if they're happy with it,
well, I mean, that could apply to any job, couldn't it?
No, I agree.
Any outside job, there could still be a conflict of interest. But yes, it is down to the voters to decide if their MP is doing the job that they elected them for.
Why should people who are good at appearing on media subsidise the media companies by not being paid for their appearances?
Well, you can take them off, but you've got to be fair across the board, which is, I go back to my point about it just seemed to me, if I'm reading this committee is saying we don't like Nigel Farage appearing on GBNews, so we'll knock him out. But if there's a Labour MP who's writing a piece for the New Statesman, that's absolutely fine. This is absurd. This is double standards.
And you can write a piece for your local newspaper, which is intended to maintain your income. You may not be paid for it immediately, but the whole aim of it is to get re-elected.
Yes, but you're not being, as you say, you're not being paid for it directly.
But indirectly. Anyway, thank you to my panel. My view is this can only be changed by legislation. It cannot be done by motion in the House. Anyway, in a moment, State of the Nation's book club makes an epic return with Conservative philosopher Madsen Pirie to discuss his new book, The Philosophy of Conservatism.
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
With her novels Persuasion and Northanger Abbey both set in Bath, the city has taken to honouring their author each year with the Jane Austen Festival. Over 3,500 Austen fans flock to the city, many in their Regency finery and many coming from abroad. You can join the throng and follow the author along streets whose buildings look much the same as when she strolled past them over 200 years ago. Dating back to 2001, the festival is the world's largest and longest-running celebration of the Romance writer. Originally created by the Jane Austen Centre in Bath and running over the course of one weekend, 23 years on, it's grown into a 10-day festival with more than 80 events. And to tell us more, I'm delighted to be joined now by author and broadcaster Jenny Trent-Hughes. Jenny, let's have a look at you. You look absolutely splendid. Well, welcome to GB News. Tell me a little bit about what you're wearing.
I'm wearing, well, usually I have a character called the Queen of All Hearts, and I have a fantastic outfit designed by Bath Theatrical. I was on the way up to you this morning. I was so excited I was going to meet you finally, and because of the trains, I didn't get to come. So I had to run back to my boat. I live on a boat, which is why the background is a bit odd, and I'm in a Regency outfit.
Well, look, I'm absolutely delighted that you have put the outfit on for us, because also someone was bringing a dress to you and her train was cancelled as well. So dressing up is obviously a big part of it. Have you any idea how many people dress up in order to participate?
Quite a few thousand.
GB News, the People's Channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and he did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. And now, the State of the Nation Book Club returns. This week with Madsen Pirie, the president of the Adam Smith Institute and conservative philosopher. His new book, The Philosophy of Conservatism, delves into the history and meaning of conservatism from Edmund Burke to Boris Johnson. Conservatism is a notoriously difficult position to define, but Madsen Pirie does a marvellous effort at it. State of the Nation Book Club starts now. Well, Madsen Pirie, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your new book, The Philosophy of Conservatism. Isn't a philosophy of conservatism, to some extent, a contradiction in terms?
Some people have supposed that, and one of the aims of the book is to show that this is not, in fact, true. Conservatism is more than just a collection of prejudices. There is a theme running right through it. There are two types of conservatism. Those who want things to stay the same, and we spell them with a little c. And then there is the political tradition, which you spell with a big C. And my book is largely about the big C.
And I was interested that in terms of the big C Conservatives, you only start with Robert Peel. And I know that's the date of the foundation of the Conservative Party. But isn't big C active political conservatism much older than that?
It's not very much older. I think it probably starts with Edmund Burke. He was the one who didn't want change to be imposed. He wanted society to evolve organically. And that is the essence of the political tradition we call conservatism.
And once you start taking it back, where do you stop? To, for example, the Civil War, where the Conservatives want the king to win because they like the power structure as it is and the lack of interference that they get in their daily lives with the regal structure. And they don't like the puritanical parliamentarian approach.
I'm not sure they wanted change at all. I would think the important thing to look at is the Industrial Revolution. Until the Industrial Revolution, your grandson could be doing what your grandfather did. Change just wasn't there. And then comes the Industrial Revolution, and change is every day. So change is now a constant part of life and society, and we have to learn how to handle it.
I've always been fascinated by the fact that Magna Carta, the barons were arguing for a reassertion of ancient rights. So what they were objecting to was that John was imposing new things on them rather than their ancient rights being observed. And that, again, seems to me to be a conservative political movement.
Yes, and you could say the same of the American colonists. They weren't trying to create something new. They were trying to preserve their traditional rights as Englishmen, as they put it. But there wasn't a Conservative Party to implement that, and there wasn't a Conservative government. It has historically, in Britain, been largely within the Conservative Party since Robert Peel.
It seems to me that conservatism is actually fundamentally Christian, that there are two strong Christian beliefs that underpin conservatism. One is they believe in free will, and the second is that they believe in original sin, and that this runs through all conservative thought from the time of Christ.
There are many people who are not Christians who advocate free will and who believe that human nature is such it will never be perfect.
But we are strongly influenced in this country by the Christian tradition.
It's part of our cultural history.
Absolutely right. And the socialist, in some ways admirably, thinks that you can create a new Jerusalem. The conservative looks back at history and recognises, now I put in terms of original sin, you wouldn't, but that's just for the birds. And that this goes back much beyond Robert Peel.
Socialists believe that when the perfect egalitarian classless society is achieved, time stops. There's no more change. People of the conservative political persuasion suppose that change will be a constant factor and we'll always need to adapt to it. When society is all the same, it stops.
Whereas if you are a conservative, you always think you can strive to be better because you can never be perfect.
Life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, said Jefferson, not the achievement of it.
Of happiness. You refer in your book to the Popper idea of the conservative working on sort of individual things that happen to fit together rather than having a big overarching strategy. And I think you make a fascinating case about individual conservative leaders doing that. That's another important part of it, isn't it? That you do what you can, you don't think you can achieve everything.
No, and you do know that when change comes, on the whole, it has been beneficial for us. We've got richer, we've acquired more leisure time, we have vastly more opportunities to do fulfilling things than we had, but change has its losers, and they've passed Factory Acts and Mines Act and Child Labour Acts in order to smooth away the edges so that change isn't as vicious to some of its losers as it might otherwise be.
And this is very Disraelian, isn't it? The Disraeli's commitment to improving the condition of the people. I'm quite interested in the fact that he writes about this in his novels, that it seems as if he knew what he wanted to do, he was just waiting to have the power to do it, rather than suddenly thinking of it for short-term electoral advantage once he'd got power.
I think that is true to some extent of many Conservative prime ministers. It isn't a vision of what society will be like in the future. We leave that to socialists. It is a vision of how society ought to operate. In other words, it's about the process of society, not the outcome. That is, I think, what Disraeli and Peel and Churchill and Thatcher had in common.
That what they were trying to do was to allow people to better their own lives.
Correct.
With a little bit of a helping hand.
At the edges.
At the edges, and you have the Artisans' Dwelling Act and things like that, that try and again you quote Adam Smith, that governments have an interest in stopping that because that protects the rights of individual, and the Conservatives have always believed in a smaller rather than a bigger state because free will, individuals make better choices for themselves.
Yes, it's the difference between laissez-faire and free market capitalism. Laissez-faire, you leave things alone, and power might well accumulate to robber barons. Free market capitalism means you have to intervene to prevent monopolies, to stop illegal deals, underhand deals to fix prices and other such anti-consumer practices. And if you're going to protect individual freedom and allow society to emerge by the decisions people make individually, you've got to protect people from abuse by tyrants. You need a strong defence force. You need to be keen on law and order and protection of property. They are essential to the process of preserving that individual liberty and the ability of society to emerge organically.
Madsen, thank you very much indeed, and I expect your book, The Philosophy of Conservatism, is available in all good bookstores, and it's bound to be available from Dr. Amazon, if not. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the very distinguished Madsen Pirie, the president of the Adam Smith Society, and you obviously know who Adam Smith was, very distinguished Scottish Enlightenment economist. And finally, I've been bursting to discuss Somerset's heroic success against Surrey today. The Surrey Drudges, led by Jordan Clark, who scored no runs, a duck for 47 balls, wanted to make the game a really boring draw and spin it out to the bitter end, and making no effort at all to win. But phenomenal performances by Somerset spinners put them in their place. The find of the season, Archie Vaughan, son of Michael, I think Michael will soon be known as father of Archie, took another 5 wickets for 38 runs, totalling 11 wickets in the match, while Jack Leach, our famous leading spinner, snapped up 5 for 37. The sun is shining and the cider is flowing in Somerset tonight, and I'm going to be heading there once this programme's ended. Well, up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, are you going to devote your whole programme to the glories of Somerset and how well we did against boring old Surrey in the Championship today?
No, but I have watched the highlights and it is a spectacular match. But I'm going to be talking about slightly more serious matters, maybe. Should we sack the NHS directors and fat cats? Another devastating report. They've got more money than ever, worse results than ever. Any other walk of life, they'd be out on their backsides. Why not in our beloved NHS? Labour refusing to publish the impact assessment on cutting the winter fuel payments. What are they hiding? Unions are getting involved in the Israel-Hamas conflict. Will they strike over foreign policy? And should refugees go free to English heritage sites?
Well, as always, that's going to be a very interesting programme. Now, I'm shocked you think that there's any more serious subject than Somerset potentially winning the county championship for the first time in our history. Anyway, that's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I'm zooming off to sunny Somerset in seconds.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good evening. It's going to be a very cold night tonight with a chance of frost, particularly across northern areas, but also a chance of spotting the aurora or the northern lights across parts of Scotland and northern England. We've got cold Arctic air at the moment, but that will be replaced by Atlantic air as high pressure builds in for the last day of the week into Friday. So that will develop clear skies quite widely, so a good chance of spotting the aurora as far south as northern areas of England, parts of Northern Ireland too. A few showers still clipping the coast of East Anglia overnight tonight, but for many of us it's going to be a clear, dry and cold night. Chance of frost rurally just about anywhere away from the very far southeast. Towns and cities should be above zero by tomorrow morning though, and it will be a fairly bright start to the day on Friday. The sunshine's still got some warmth to it and the winds will be much lighter tomorrow morning, so it should still feel fairly pleasant first thing. Across coastal areas there is still a risk of the odd shower and more in the way of cloud, particularly as we look further north and west to parts of western Scotland, Northern Ireland, where there is a greater risk of a few showers first thing tomorrow, as those westerly winds are bringing in the next weather front through Friday afternoon. That will spread into parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, turning the sunshine much hazier as we head towards lunchtime. But elsewhere across the UK, it's going to be actually a dry and fine day, a much more settled day to come tomorrow compared to today. Less of a risk of any of those showers rattling through. It won't feel too bad in the sunshine. Temperatures are still below average, but it's definitely warmer than it has been lately, and it will become even warmer as we head into Saturday as well, as we pick up that westerly wind more widely. Still potentially a fairly chilly start though across parts of England and Wales, but it's quite windy and wet weather will push into parts of western Scotland, Northern Ireland through Saturday, and we'll see the rain persist here all the way through until Saturday evening, and then when it will sink further south into more central areas, with further wet weather to come early next week across the north. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good luck.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation. You haven't